So, have you ever heard the phrase church growth? Have you heard the longer phrase, the church growth movement? Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. I found that those who have heard church growth or the church growth movement have a perspective on it that's not always correct. And I'm going to be sharing what the church growth movement is and what it is not so that we can correct some misperceptions and perhaps get a little bit of history as well. And I hope it won't be boring history. If those of you think I'm going to do a historical excursion, that it might be a bit boring, but I'm going to talk about this whole thing about why most critics of the church growth movement are wrong. And I'll tell you why in just a minute. Always thank you, Belay. Belay Solutions, the organization that provides productivity by providing people for your organization. These people are actually part of Belay, but they come to be a worker in your organization while Belay matches them with you. They have this screening process for these workers that is second to none. And you may decide you want to bring someone on for 10 hours, 15 or 20. We have found at Church Answers that when we get these Belay workers, that their productivity is far higher than the number of hours they work compared to other workers. You need a bookkeeper. You need an executive assistant. Go to Belay. They're productive. They provide productivity. They help do the things that you shouldn't be doing in your sweet spot. Also, they have a relatively new ebook, The Power of Productivity. You can download it by going to Thom at 55123. That's Thom, Thom, at 55123. Why most critics of the church growth movement are wrong. What is the church growth movement? The church growth movement is a formal missiological movement that started in 1955 with the publication of the book, The Bridges of God by Donald A. McGavran. I bet you didn't expect to hear that when I said church growth movement. The church growth movement is a formal missiological movement that began in 1955 with the publication of the book, The Bridges of God by Donald A. McGavran. Now, just to be clear, Donald McGavran was not a very fluid writer. He was an incredible missiologist. He brought much to the world in terms of evangelism, but many people have not read The Bridges of God just because the way that Donald McGavran writes. But Donald McGavran was a genius. He was a spiritual giant as well. He was a missionary to India. And he saw that the mission work of the mission organization of which he was a part was really not reaching people for Christ. The people who would come would just be people who were already Christians. And he said, this is not what we're called to do. I'm on the mission field. And I'm on the mission field to reach people with the gospel of Christ. So Donald McGavran began actually measuring the effectiveness of what they were doing. And he eliminated some of the activities that were not reaching people with the gospel and added some that were. Eventually, he came back to his home state, to the United States, and he became the founding dean of the Fuller School of Missions and World Missions and Church Growth. And as he went to that seminary, he became this influence across the United States, where his greatest passion was helping churches focus more upon evangelism. Now, there were some decisions that were made that I think, when it's all said and done, probably were not the best decisions. One of them was to call the movement the church growth movement. Church growth is an ambiguous term for many, a broad term for others, that can carry a lot of baggage with it, or perhaps lack of clarity. And church growth was what they call this movement, but McGavran meant evangelistic growth when he said church growth. He said a church is not truly growing unless it's growing by new converts. And so when he said church growth, he was talking about evangelistic movement. What happened is some of the churches in America adopted church growth methodology without the heart of conversion growth. And many people became critical of the church growth movement because they said all it is about numbers, nickels, numbers, and megachurches, which it was far from. In his latter years, McGavran, obviously becoming a little bit disenchanted with the way church growth was mischaracterized, he wrote a book called Effective Evangelism, which is what he really meant when he started talking about church growth. Now, effective evangelism was basically about the way seminaries and ministry training centers need to change, but that's what he was talking about. We need to change really what we're talking about when we say church growth. So now when many people are critical of the church growth movement, what they're doing is directing their criticism sometimes to megachurches, sometimes to easy growth. And I say that, well, for you who are on YouTube, I'll do the air quotes, easy growth in churches. Some use it as a criticism for non-biblical growth. Some of it uses a criticism for one of the principles that I'm not going to get into, called the homogeneous unit principle, which is another podcast into itself. But that wasn't all the church growth movement. In fact, that was not the essence of McGavran's argument. Now, his book, The Bridges of God, came out in 1955. And what he was saying is we need to build bridges to reach people with the gospel. We need to remove the impediment. Those are the bridges. Those are the bridges of God. He became a great influence in the United States. Unfortunately, while he was an influence to many for the right reasons, his approach was mischaracterized by many, and therefore church growth became a term really that many people saw as very critical. And so I ended up doing my research on the church growth movement, and for my dissertation, for my PhD, I began to learn its history. And I know this, when I talk about the church growth movement, and hey, it was born in 1955, which happens to be the same year I was born, and it was a movement started by Donald A. McGavran. It just doesn't register with most people. It has more of a negative connotation to people with whom I have association than others. I am appreciative of people like Gary McIntosh and others who provide clarity for what the church growth movement is instead of is not, the historical church growth movement. But most people, and I could also mention Nelson Searcy in there. He's done a lot of great work providing that type of clarity. But most people in the field that I'm in, church consulting, church health, they either don't know about the church growth movement or they join the others in being critical of it. Now, here's the bottom line. Why am I a church growth movement advocate? In the true historical church growth movement, the emphasis was on growing churches by reaching people with the gospel. That was the essence of where McGavran began in India. Then he came to Fuller Seminary in later. He before that wrote his book called The Bridges of God. His emphasis was, hey, if a church is not reaching people with the gospel, it's not doing what it's supposed to do. And that's where I became passionate about the church growth movement. I've known it's had a lot of outgrowths in subsequent generations, and I know that it is something that most people don't even think about. One year I received the Donald McGavran Church Growth Award for recognition of the doing work in that field. And I got to say this isn't a humble brag, I guess it's just a brag. That was one of the most rewarding recognitions that I've ever had, because I knew who Donald McGavran was. I knew what his heart was. And even though I had very little contact with him, I read his material with great hunger. And I realized his message that we need to be reaching people with the gospel of Jesus Christ to grow our churches needs to be the message of my life as well. So he influenced me greatly. And if I've had any influence on anybody else, from a human perspective, much of it began with Donald McGavran. Please don't be a critic of the church growth movement until you fully understand how it started and what it was meant to do. Once again, thank you, Belay, for being our sponsor. Let me remind you of a book that I have released, and that book is called When the People Pray. It is a 30-day guide to take your people through to pray for your pastor. I would encourage pastors to tell the church members about it. Don't be shy. I'd encourage church members to initiate a 30-day movement in your church to pray for your pastor. It is something that I think can be a great renewal and a great revival in your church. As always, thank you for being a part of the Church Answers podcast. Every week, we release 3 new bite-sized, around 10-minute podcasts, and we try to focus on one issue and one nugget every single time. We'll see you not only this week, but 3 podcasts every week. Again, it's called the Church Answers Podcast. We're glad you joined us. Hey, folks, this is a PS to our podcast. We got some exciting stuff that we want to offer you absolutely for free. Sam, when you think about predictive factors in a church's growth. If you take out demographics, what are some things that come to mind? Just two. I mean, don't give me a list of 10. Just 2 or 3 things that come to mind on predictive growth of a church.
Well, evangelism and whether the church is doing it or not.
Bingo.
And then I will add, is it an ongoing evangelism emphasis?
Double bingo. Well? Double, and maybe something about leadership and their commitment to that. So all of the above.
Evangelistic churches have evangelistic pastors. Is the staff, is the lead pastor doing the work themselves?
We have a free download for you, and it's actually a sheet that you can self-score. You answer 20 questions, anywhere from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And we come back and we predict what your growth rate is going to be for the next year in worship attendance. It's not a perfect tool, but it's a good tool. There's a link to that for the attendance predictor. Look in the show notes. You'll absolutely love it. That's cool. We'll see you soon.